Hello, welcome to week 2 of Office Hours. This is still my office. Most of it is still a mess, so I'm still not eager to show you much of it. Unfortunately, I'm having to show you more of it this week because I made the mistake last week of not taping in the format that the Coursera platform demands, the widescreen format. So now I am doing that, and you can see more of my office. For example, my dog Fraser sleeping over there on the chair, possibly wondering why I'm doing what I'm doing here, talking to something other than a person or a dog, which are the things he normally sees me talk to. Okay, so this week, the award for most creative metaphor related to a meditation retreat goes to Wynn Matthews. In the discussion forum, he said, "In retreats, at times of broad stillness, I've experienced the feeling of being squeezed like a toothpaste tube." What does he mean? I'm going to hold you in suspense for a second and go over to the Facebook page where Carl Mountain said something that's related to what Wynn Matthews said. Carl Mountain says, having seen me say in one of the lectures that our feelings are not necessarily to be trusted, he says, I would suggest, as many Buddhist teachers have already, that it is not just feelings that can't be trusted, but moreover, you can't trust your thoughts as being true. That is certainly the case. But there is a connection between those two issues, the untrustworthiness of feelings and of thoughts, and that brings us back to the tube of toothpaste. What Wynn Matthews went on to say about this feeling of being squeezed like a tube of toothpaste was, there's a very subtle pressure, tension, constriction, and out of that comes a thought stream, a reaction to the feeling tone. So in other words, he was sensing when he reflected on his interior life, as you are inclined to do on a meditation retreat, that feelings were governing thoughts, that feelings were eliciting thoughts. He says earlier, every sensory input comes with a feeling tone, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and reactions to those feeling tones cause certain thought streams. I think it's right. I think thoughts certainly can elicit feelings, but feelings can elicit thoughts, and I think they do so more subtly than we often realize. And you become aware of these kinds of subtle things through the meditation practice, and I think a retreat is a particularly good place to become aware of them. Now, as for the virtues of this degree of attentiveness to your interior life and a kind of a mindful perspective, Wynn goes on to say the following. This was in response to a post in the discussion forum by Camilla Balkan, who had raised the question of the distinction between feelings and emotions. And here's what Wynn Matthews went on to say in the course of his reply. When my wife says something that I don't like, and a strong feeling of dislike arises in the body, and when, by the way, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've been there. He goes on to say that being aware of the feeling of dislike, rather than being, kind of reflexively captive to it, changes his reaction. He says, it may take a minute for it to pass, but I'm able to respond to what she's said rather than react. And I know exactly that feeling too. I remember after my first meditation retreat, in the days after my first meditation retreat, I remember like my kids would do something that would make me feel like yelling at them, and I would get the feeling to yell at them, the feeling that normally preceded yelling at them, but it's like I would observe it and not act on it. And it was amazing, and that's something that's easier for me to do right after meditation retreat, but at any time, if the more I'm practicing the meditation, the easier that kind of thing is. So like right now, I'm doing 30, 40 minutes of meditation every morning. It hasn't transformed me into a wonderful person, But my wife says it makes me a better person, and she should know. So, speaking of which, Cameron Kingsbury, this was in the discussion forum, says, I have noticed an emphasis on separating the self from an emotion. Instead of saying, I am angry, one can say, I am experiencing anger. And that gets at the distinction, yes, between kind of owning the feeling and letting the feeling own you on the one hand, and seeing the feeling as somewhere in your realm of consciousness, but not being captivated by it. That said, I do think it's a lot harder than just saying this, right? I mean, just saying, you can't, I mean, if you just say, well, from now on, whenever I'm angry, I'll just, instead of saying I am angry, I'll say I am experiencing anger. Well, no, probably, by the time I'm just saying, without the meditation practice, it's going to be hard for little reminders like that to really take root, at least in my experience. Another feeling-related question. This one came in via Twitter, and again, probably the surest way to get make sure I at least see a question is to address it to @DarwinDharma on Twitter. I mean, I'm doing my best to keep up with everything on discussion forum, Facebook, Twitter, and my two assistants are as well. But I sometimes miss things because they go by so quickly on the forum and sometimes on Facebook. Whereas Twitter, for one thing, the traffic is just slower, I guess. Well, anyway, back to Melissa, whose Twitter handle is MindXGeek. She says, if unpleasant emotions are linked to avoidance and pleasant ones to approach, how to explain rage and anger? Now, this gets at something I said when I quoted a 19th century biologist saying that what feelings seem to be about is, pleasant feelings get the organism to approach things that are good for it, like food. Unpleasant feelings like fear get it to escape from things like predators or leave the vicinity of things like toxins. And Melissa is asking, well, what about rage and anger? The which kind of feel bad. I guess she's saying they kind of feel bad, but you don't run away from the person, right? You like accost the person, approach the person in anger. Well, first of all, I'd say that quote from the biologist, that was kind of in the first instance, when feelings arose in evolution. This seems to be the kind of primordial function of positive and negative, pleasant, unpleasant feelings, approach, avoidance. Once you get to being as complicated as humans, it's complicated. So, for example, I might have pleasant feelings about one person, unpleasant feelings towards another. What that leads me to do in some cases is not either approach or avoid either one. It leads me to say good things about the first person and bad things about the other. And there are a lot of, the more complicated the animal, the more complicated things have gotten as evolution has, made use of these feelings in kind of increasingly, you might say, convoluted ways. That said, I would also suggest to Melissa that if she pays close attention to rage and anger, she may feel like that, she may see that in some ways, there's something pleasant is maybe a misleading word, but when you're angry, it feels good. Something, to yell, and also when you are angry and a rage, you feel you're right and they're wrong, and that's a good feeling, right? It may not be a true feeling, that's the point. And this gets back to the relationship between feelings and thoughts. This feeling, which is not to be trusted, will sponsor a thought, which is not to be trusted, which is that you're always right, and the other people are wrong. How's Fraser doing? Yeah, I see he's not really inspired by my little discourse here. Fraser's the least, I have two dogs. Fraser is the least Buddhist dog in the house, the less Buddhist of the two. But maybe I'll save that for another day. Okay, so one last thing on that. I think if I've got this quote right, the Buddha is said to have said that anger is the unless he was talking about hatred, but I think it was anger. The poisoned root with the honeyed tip, suggesting that that he too thought there was something actually pleasant about anger, and seductively pleasant. And in any event, it is certainly true that all of these subtleties of feeling and their connection to thought and so on, awareness of that is something that in principle mindfulness can foster, and in principle you can carry that into your everyday life, and be less vulnerable to the misleading drift and the untruthful drift sometimes of both feelings and thoughts. Now, I'm going to stop here because for various reasons, and then talk about some other stuff. Okay. Now, some people, I think in the discussion forum in particular, have raised questions about kind of the validity of evolutionary psychology. How confident can we be of the various kinds of theories that you're hearing about? Isn't this all very conjectural? Actually, some of it is quite conjectural. Usually, I label the conjectural stuff by using the word conjectural. I think I've said that several times in the lectures already. When I'm talking about things that I think are particularly speculative. And some things are more speculative than others in evolutionary psychology. I want to talk a little about a kind of a handicap it faces compared to some other sciences. Okay. In physics, in much of physics, you have a theory about the way particles behave. You can do experiments, set up an experiment that could in principle falsify that hypothesis. Depending on how it turns out, you do the experiment. It sheds light on the hypothesis. Evolutionary psychology, though, is kind of about history, right? In fact, that distinguishes it from ordinary psychology. Ordinary psychology tries to discern the structure of the mind. Evolutionary psychology does that as well and draws on many of the findings of ordinary psychology. But to that, it adds the question of, well, how did the structure come to be the way it is? Are some aspects of the structure we seem to be discerning of the mind designed features of natural selection? Well, that's a question that's about the past. It's about history. And one thing you can't do is rewind history and play it again with some of the variables altered to test your hypothesis about the past. Historians can't do it. Evolutionary psychologists can't do it. And in fact, evolutionary biologists in general can't do it. When you think about it, some of the things you probably just accepted as truths about the biological world, like, well, polar bears are white because that helps them blend in an atmosphere of snow and ice, right? It's good camouflage. Well, that's a plausible story. It's probably true. But we don't have the kind of evidence to support that you sometimes see in other sciences, right? Because we can't say, well, let's go back, millions of years and make half of the Arctic Circle green and leave the other half white and see if the bears that evolve in the green part are different from the bears that evolve, right? We can't do that. We can't do it in the case of human evolution. Now, you don't generally see people get all upset when people when a scientist kind of asserts that the polar bear is white for purposes of camouflage. People don't usually get all upset and go, how do you know that? Because it's not a very explosive area, right? Polar bears, right? It's like you don't get a lot of dinner table arguments about polar bears, whereas you do get dinner table arguments about all kinds of aspects of human experience, and the role of genes in human experience and human thought and so on. And so, in the case of evolutionary psychology, the standards of evidence issue, although it is an issue that pervades evolutionary biology, gets particular comment. And that's good, because we should be clear that some of these theories are hard to test. There are ways to test theories. So, for example, if children are viewed from the cynical perspective of natural selection, kind of reproductive assets, then for reasons I won't get into, that should mean that at different ages, parents, their value to parents is different. And one evolutionary psychologist tested this prediction by looking at how the extent to which parents grieve over the deaths of children at different ages. In theory, they should grieve more over teenagers' death than a 3-week-old baby's death, but less than a 59-year-old child's death. And the findings in the study seem to bear out the hypothesis. So there are ways you can get around the kind of challenges, the kind of evidentiary, even kind of, I guess, epistemological challenges posed by any historical science. But it's not that easy, and we should keep that in mind. See, the same thing in physics, by the way. The cosmological, the theories about the birth of the universe are much harder to test than theories about the current structure of the physical world. So, all I can say is, in general, in science, all the different sciences have different kinds of challenges, and their findings have, and all of them have different findings that are at different levels of kind of solidity or warrant different levels of confidence. But the general rule is that the simplest, usually the criterion is the simplest theory that explains the data wins, at least for the time being. May turn out to be wrong, but even when the best theory, quote, best theory, is conjectural, because that's what all the theories are, it's still the case that, that's for the moment, a conjectural but plausible theory that's simpler and more straightforward and more consistent with the facts than other theories is the theory we take seriously. In some cases in evolutionary psychology, that is the case. Conjectural, yet in the running. And that's, and I try to, calibrate, express the level of confidence that I think different theories deserve. I may not always succeed, may not always remember to do it, but I try. And I would just warn you that as we go on, we will see some pretty conjectural things that I'll say, because a lot of this is kind of untrodden ground. It's not like a lot of evolutionary psychologists have gotten seriously into Buddhism and started trying to make the connections between the two. So it's really it's fertile ground, and when any field of inquiry is kind of fresh, fertile ground, you see a lot of conjectural stuff, and that's the way the scientific dialogue gets started. Speculative theories, you throw them out there, and you see what people say. In some cases, they may provoke other people to come up with better theories, and that's good. That's part of the process. And that's where we are here. And I guess that's about... Is there anything else I want to say about that? Well, I guess, being an organism and being designed to pursue my self-interest, I should mention that my book, The Moral Animal, very much tries to address this. It's a book for the unconvinced, and I try at kind of casual book length to explain why this worldview broadly deserves confidence, even though individual hypotheses deserve varying degrees of confidence. So it's there if anybody is just deeply, deeply interested in the question of evolutionary psychology's validity. But the main point is just, this is what science is. All progress starts as hypotheses begin as speculation, and then they either amass evidence over time, or they don't, or they are replaced by a hypothesis that's clearly superior. That's life. And I think that's probably enough of office hours for this week. Although there's so many good questions, it's kind of frustrating. I really think, in theory, if I had enough time, I should go to like, you know, just a schedule of like, you know, like every day or every hour or every minute, you know, tape another office hours. But other things intrude. So anyway, we'll see you when we see you. One more thing, just quickly. You could be excused for doubting that my dog Frazier is an actual dog because he has exhibited so little movement in the course of this office hours. And I just want to establish that Frazier is an actual dog. And the way you do that, I found, if Frazier hears the sound of me reaching into a box of shredded wheat, that he sometimes springs to life. Let's see if this works. Hey, Frazier. Look, it's a box of shredded wheat. You want some? Frazier wouldn't mind some shredded wheat. Do you want to be seen eating it on camera? You just want to be seen eating it, period. Okay. Let me give both dogs a little shredded wheat. I feel I shouldn't hold them in suspense like that. I do want to show you the other dog, Milo, because Milo is actually, here, Milo. I just want people to see him. Okay, that's Milo. Milo is actually closer to being a Buddhist than Frazier, for reasons that maybe I'll explain in a subsequent office hours. I mean, doesn't he look kind of wise in a way? Not that Frazier is unwise. Okay, next time.